Hi, and you're welcome to a quick overview and introduction based on Robert Gray, the Australian poet. So basically, what you guys need to understand is who Robert Gray is and how we can understand a little bit more about him. So he was born in Coffs Harbour in 1945. This is a small town, I'm sure you're all aware, that during this time it promoted his love for the natural world, which indeed contrasted with his, sort of troubled upbringing. You know, his dad was perceived to be an alcoholic, and his mum was a Jehovah's Witness. So there was obviously a bit of tension at home for this individual growing up. And I think when you look at his poetry, I think the purpose of poetry is to give pleasure first and foremost, and it does this particularly for somebody who's interested in words. And indeed, Gray was extremely interested in words. You know, he was when he was younger, he had a keen interest in writing and in drawing, but this interest in writing developed into the fact that he became involved with the local newspaper. But primarily, we just want to look at the fact that poetry is a visual art, and it conveys ideas about emotions through imagery. As you're all aware, images are the pictures we have in our mind, which can change depending on our perspective and, of course, our memory. They can, of course, be, certain images portrayed within poetry can be sort of rearranged. They can be manipulated. They can be, magnified. They can be broken down in every possible way, which is in part owing to each individual's perspective and imagination. And indeed, when you look at Gray himself, he says that his poetry is really about what is sublime, being right here in the ordinary. He says, I've always felt that the deepest mystery and whatever answer there might be is nowhere else but here, right on the surface of life. He says that his poetry is about this sense, and at that same time about the great interests of man, air and light, the joy of having a body, the voluptuousness of looking. And when you look at the style and the figurative language that he uses, the poetic devices that he uses within his work, they are overwhelmingly constructed with similes. And he says the copious use of similes is all to do with the visual precision and clarity. He wanted to sort of take influence from what imagists want, but he says they've carried it forward further than the original exponent of the style. So he says the more accurately that you want to define a thing, the more you have to bring in aspects of other things. So this points to the very interdependence of everything, of all qualities. And this is where you may find that you may find in your readings that Gray was a Buddhist, or he had a strong belief in Buddhism. And this whole point that the very interdependence of everything is a Buddhist idea, in fact, it's the central one. And this is what Buddhism means by there is no self-nature in anything. And he also feels that with his use of similes that they involve two separate terms. He says there's no blurring two separate things together as with symbols or metaphors. It's like keeping an outline around each one and yet making them dependent on each other. And, we know him as a poet, but he is an artist, so he does draw and paint, although as an amateur. And he sees this occupation as a sort of a natural complement to the writing of poetry. He's trying to get the visual experience becoming language, because he says writing becomes inward. Drawing is like going out into the world again. It's like going outdoors. I return to words freshened with a determination to relate them closer to things, not to be caught up in opaque and self-absorbed language. So to reiterate, he feels that his poems are about the visual experience becoming language. And if we look at his poetry, the question is there. It says, is he an imagist? Now, he is time to time described as an imagist, poet, but this is only partly accurate. Like, there's no doubt that his poems are full of imagery, as I said, similes mostly, but it is a mistake to assume that these images are present for their own sake. Like, he himself says that his poetry is full of images because he wants to particularize every natural thing that appears in it, out of respect, you might say. He says in his poems, nothing is a symbol for everything else. Okay, that's interesting, but nothing is a symbol for anything else, and everything has its own worth and is presented directly. The overall effect is one of clarity and light. So I think that his main objective is to achieve a maximum of clarity. I think that the imagery he uses is an explanatory device rather than a decorative one. Okay, so it has a purpose. It is an explanatory device rather than decorative. So he says that each simile that he uses is drawn in order to bring a picture more clearly into focus. So you could sort of look at, regarding his style of writing, the thought in his poems is clear and explicit. In one interview, he actually stated that they had a preference for simile over metaphors and other forms of figurative language, on the grounds that a simile is the most truthful way of comparing one thing to another. Okay, so he says that a simile is the most truthful way of comparing one thing to another. And he says a metaphor, by definition, is not literally true, while the qualifying like or as if of a simile means at least that the trope is not untrue. Now, when we look at his influences, you got to look at his first experience of poetry. He says there was one Friday afternoon in August when he was 12 years old in the classroom, and the teacher was reading The Wind and the Willows, and the teacher came to the part where the mole and the rat were having breakfast together, and it seems that Mole buttered some toast on the butter. The hot butter on the toast dripped through the toast like honey dripping out of a honeycomb, dripping through the toast. And he went on reading, and Gray stopped there because that was an epiphany for him. That was his revelation, his moment of truth. He realized that this was exactly what you see. So basically, the hot butter drips out of the toast, through the toast, like honey out of a honeycomb. I'd seen that, but I'd never noticed it, is what Gray said. And then, when it occurred in the book, I suddenly realized that what Gray had seen, he'd never really seen it, he'd never experienced it. And it was the writer of The Wind and the Willows, who made Gray experience it. And it gave him the intense experiences of life. And he then, at that point, realized, at 12 years of age, what imagery can do. That it gives us life, it makes us aware of life, that all the things that pass us by in life, all the blooming, buzzing confusion of life can be saved. Things can be saved out of that torrent and preserved. And he says that we can be made to experience them much more intensely, such as the power of language. And he thinks these things, these simple things, can be explored so vividly through one's writing. So when we look at, I suppose, Gray's poetry and the detailed analysis that we need to look at, we really need to sort of look at how, in your responses, you can delve deeper into his poems, talking about the form and the feature and structure of each and every poem. Okay, so you need to be able to explore in detailed analysis each poem.
So ultimately, when we look at Gray's poetry, we need to focus on the ideas within each poem. Okay, and within each of these ideas, we need to be able to sort of see the techniques that he uses to convey these ideas, but also the values that are presented and the context they expose. In other words, you need to provide this sort of central evidence that sort of is able to sort of identify what Gray's purpose was. Now, when we look at Gray's poetry, we need to look at his aspects of identity, and not this singular idea of what identity is. You're more so looking at a literal identity, a geographical identity, but also this metaphysical sense of identity as well that he has constructed and that we indeed have constructed for ourselves. And we need to be able to sort of look at how this has been impacted or how it has been affected or indeed reimagined as a result of engaging with his poetry. And when we look at his poetry, the question is asked, do we read it literally? Because over the years, when we look at poetry, we have always sought to explore poems and their sort of hidden meaning or their symbolic meaning or what the composer is trying to represent. But Gray himself says that his poetry should be read literally. Okay? And he says that as it should be read literally, we should resist any attempt to read his work as having some sort of embedded or hidden or cryptic messages. Okay? So, yes, there are ideas about identity, society, and the power of nature, and the tensions that can occur between all of those things. But we need to look at the catalysts and the transformations experienced by Gray, because these are then opportunities for us to experience moments of transformation as we begin to see the world through his clever use of imagery and insight. And indeed, this imagery and insight exposes both the beauty and ugliness of society. So yes, his work has an inherent beauty and at times does expose that beauty, but also the ugliness of society. And as such, his body of work and these poems in particular are ideally situated in the canons of Australian literature. And I think that when we look at any sort of form, any sort of fiction, non-fiction, play or poetry, they allow us to think about how a text is created and how meaning is made and why. Okay, with any text, they come with a range of concepts or ideas that can be confronting, they can be provocative, but they can be transformational for readers. And Gray here has demonstrated in his poetry change and evolution through his experience. He experienced growth both spiritually and intellectually. And this is made evident, through him exposing his experiences of his life in a literal and metaphorical representation that mirrors his and maybe our cultural identity. And when we look at his style, okay, Gray's imagery, okay, is the first thing a reader notices. Now, it can be classed as quite surprising. It can be classed as quite evocative. But what we got to really sort of look to explore here is the fact that whilst his images, they're not severe, they're not confronting, but they are complex and they are affecting, okay? Partly because they seem in the same instant true and precarious. And I've taken an extract here from the Sydney Review of Books where they looked at a specific image from Journey to the North Coast, written in 1974, which says, "Down these slopes move, as a nude descends a staircase, slender white gums." And they say it is unforgettable because it makes the mind work between stillness and movement. It is a downward stepping, pictured step by step and all at once. And I think that if you were to look at if you were to recall what I commented on earlier, Gray points to the very interdependence of everything, of all qualities. This Buddhist idea, indeed, it's the central Buddhist idea that there is no self-nature in anything. So he's saying that there's no blurring between two separate things. It's about making each dependent on each other here. Okay, so he's pointing to the interdependence of everything. Okay, so this image captures not only the look of the landscape from a train window, when the movement of the train can make the land appear to move, it also captures the way in which memory holds a run of time in a single image. In this way, the image shows like a hairline crack. Okay, a hairline crack. The difference between something held in memory and something seen in an instant from a passing train. And then we move on to the HSC poems. Okay, you're going to be looking at 6 poems this term. Journey to the North Coast, Harbour Dusk, Byron Bay Winter, Description of a Walk, 24 poems, and Flames and Dangling Wire. So NESA have stipulated that this is an entire text, so you need to be aware that you need to explore and analyze and become experts in each and every one of these 6 poems, okay? Because they could technically, for internal and indeed the HSC, a particular poem could be stipulated to be used as a central part of your response. So Journey to the North Coast could be used, but then again also could Flames and Dangling Wire. So it is so important that you are able to engage with all 6 texts as best you can. And when we look at the rubric, here we go, it says that a substantial literary text, an informed understanding, knowledge and appreciation of the 6 poems. So through your development of considered personal responses to the text in its entirety. There's your 6 poems that you need to be able to consider. You explore and analyze the ways and characteristics of the text and understand the ways in which these characteristics establish its distinctive qualities. Okay, so what makes it distinctive? What gives it integrity? What gives it value? Why do we value these poems? Okay. We also look at how you explore and interpret the texts and the way that these poems portray people, ideas, settings and situations in texts. So you could be looking to comment on the way that the portrayal of people or ideas is conveyed in 2 or 3 poems, okay, at a time. So when you look at the interplay between the ideas, forms and language within the 6 poems, you need to appreciate how these elements all give a text value and give it that sort of sense of integrity to us. So you need to base your knowledge on detailed knowledge of the text, base your judgment, I should say, on detailed knowledge of the text and its language features. Okay. Now I know that we've said that Gray uses a copious amount of similes here, okay, but that's not enough. Okay, you need to comment on how and why he creates meaning within his poems. Okay, so you need to be able to sort of analyze, assess, and comment on the specific language features. Okay, increasingly complex ideas clearly and cohesively. Now, cohesively means that it's all blended together quite well. It is coherent. It is easily understood by your marker. Okay, you need to use appropriate register structure and modality. You need to continuously appraise and refine your own responses using conventions of syntax, spelling, and grammar appropriately. And then ultimately, through your own compositions, you further develop your personal and intellectual connections with and enjoyment of the text. Enjoyment of the text, that's something that's at the end of the rubric, but it is important. If you are passionate and you enjoy the texts, it'll be evident in the language that you use in your response. This is a skill that you can start to work on as of now. But look, thanks for listening to this overview and background information about Gray and his poetry and his style. I hope it helped. If you have any questions, please ask.